Welcome to Beyond the Balance Sheet, the podcast that helps advisors, clinical professionals, and affluent families understand the complexities of issues related to our mental, physical, and emotional well-being. Our co-hosts, Arden O'Connor and Diana Clark, will interview a series of guests on a range of topics, providing informative content and practical tools for professionals and families to consider. Here are your hosts, Arden and Diana.
Hi, and welcome to an episode of Beyond the Balance Sheet podcast. Today's guest is Peter Hogan, a youngish man in long-term recovery, as I define it, a man who grew up with privilege in what we would classify in our United States as an ultra-competitive, ultra-successful suburban area in a very high-achieving area of Boston, Massachusetts. And he has a very touching story, but not necessarily as unique as we would like to think. So, welcome, Peter Hogan. Thank you very much for talking with us today. I feel really honored to have you. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. We'll get into our history together and apart, but it's good.
Right. I feel like I like to take credit for just the beginning of Peter's recovery story. He takes on after that. But Peter, tell us a little bit. Where'd you grow up? What did you do? Where did your story begin?
Sure. So I grew up, like you said, in a small suburban town. Well, it's not really that small, but small suburban town outside of Boston, which I'm happy to identify by name, but there's only a few that fit that bill, so you can probably guess which one I'm talking about. And I think it's exactly as you described, really competitive. If you're not sort of following a very particular path, there's a lot of judgment, either being imposed on you by yourself or explicitly imposed on you by others. And I think as I grew up and I got really into sports and school and friends and kind of everything that a normal kid would, regardless of the way that they were raised. I was exposed to drugs at a really young age. And I think...
What's a really young age, Peter?
The first time that I used any mind-altering substance was 12 years old. And I was a little bit young for my grades.
That's a really young age.
That was the summer after 8th grade. So I was a year younger than everybody else. So I was always the small guy. But the summer going into freshman year of high school was the first time that I experienced anything like that.
Okay. And what did that trigger for you? What did your brain say that first few times?
Yeah. I think there's a thing we like to talk about in some 12-step programs is that we discover alcohol and the excitement amidst the excitement of life, right? And then that sort of relationship with it is marred by that false sense of community and excitement for the rest of the time that I use. So the first time that I used was exactly that. I had met some new friends. I wasn't feeling so secure in my identity. I tried like skateboarding and I tried like identifying as a lacrosse player, and I sort of tried all these different things. And amongst that sort of identity crisis and lack of community, I discovered drugs. And that first experience for me was like, now I have friends and I have an identity. I can be sort of the guy that uses drugs, the guy that gets high. And I can have friends that get high and I can talk about stuff related to getting high. And now my identity is sort of sorted out for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I get that. It is a denominator in any high school, really. People who use have a community, and people who don't have to come up with some other way to identify themselves, right?
Certainly. Yeah, I think, identifying as someone who uses is probably the easiest identity to own, because if you wanted to identify as someone who got good grades, right, you have to do your homework, you have to go to class, all these things. But when you're sort of at a loss of where you fit in, identifying as someone who uses is a no-brainer, right? It takes 30 seconds to become that person. So starting at age 12 and ending at what age were you when you ultimately stopped using, Peter? It was 2014. So shortly after my mother's birthday in March, was the last time I used, and I was 18 when that ended.
So you had a really compressed history
Yeah,
of drug use. Yeah.
yeah.
Tell us a little bit
Fortunately,
about that.
sure. So uh, my first use, I smoked marijuana with some friends, like most people sort of begin their using history. Shortly after that, it definitely, it progressed quite quickly from marijuana to alcohol, and then into prescription painkillers, benzodiazepines, lots of whatever prescription drug really was available to me at any given time, and eventually onto heroin, which was the last sort of step in pushing me to getting sober. It progressed slowly at first and quickly towards the end, as my dependence on prescription painkillers grew larger and larger. Using heroin was for me, obvious next step. But yeah, I mean, I don't know how specific we should get about sort of my history, but
No, that tells it. That tells it. How did your parents find out? They must have known all along that there was some experimentation going on, and you lived in a community where that was pretty well accepted in some
yeah.
ways, that teenagers do experiment. Tell me, when they heard about the use of opioids and heroin, what was that their bottom too, would you say?
Yeah, I guess to speak to the first thing that you mentioned, this was happening I was a popular kid in high school. I went to parties and I had lots of friends, and I would consider myself, a pretty social guy. And at most of those parties, probably my junior and senior year, there were people like openly using 30 milligram oxycodone, smoking it off tinfoil, eating it, snorting it. You could do that in front of people at a party of 50 people, and it wasn't weird. I mean, in hindsight, that's pretty not acceptable for a 16-year-old or a bunch of 16-year-olds to just be doing that together in someone's basement. But it was very accepted in the community that I grew up in. When my parents first found out, I think, they found out probably every couple of weeks for the better part of those 6 years. They found out something new. My stepsister was an addict, and so they knew sort of what to look for. And I thought I was keeping it a secret for maybe the first 3 years. My parents found weed, they found alcohol and things like that with minimal consequences, and I just assumed that they had no idea kind of what the level that it was progressing to. But the first confrontation we had, and I talk about this with my parents a lot, that those probably aged 15 to 18 is pretty blurry for me. I would say I remember factually that things happened, but I don't have so much of an emotional connection to any of the memories that I have from that time. So I'll try my best to sort of recount what that looked like. But it wasn't a surprise to them, or it was more of a surprise to me that they weren't surprised, if that makes sense. They knew the whole time. I think they were more afraid to bring it up than anything. It sort of makes it real once that confrontation happens, right? Before that, it can sort of exist as this suspicion. Even if you see me doing it, if we haven't talked about it explicitly, it might not be happening. But it certainly was happening. So that confrontation was more surprising, equally surprising probably for both of us.
You went to treatment. Can you talk about your treatment experience? Because where you, in some ways, are an anomaly, Peter, in my experience over the years, is that we're not talking about repeated treatments and we're having sustained recovery. So can you talk about what your treatment looked like? Because I think it was a good model for you, and it may be illustrative for other people as well.
Sure. Yeah. I think I got really, really lucky. I know for a lot of people that have a similar history to me that it takes them an extremely long time to get sober and repeated attempts. And although the first time I really gave it a shot, it stuck. And I think that's probably true for anyone, that if you really want to get sober, there's nothing holding you back. There's no reason. Everyone is capable of getting sober. Everyone is capable of long-term recovery, but the things that worked for me treatment wise, I had gone to some shorter 30-day treatment centers, 28-day, some short stays at, detox facilities and things like that, outpatient. But all of those were to please other people, right? There was never a time when I went to an outpatient in Boston in the gloomy fall weather and I was like, yeah, this is it. This is the life that I want for myself. But, I woke up I live in Utah, not far from where the detox that I went to when I first got sober, just kind of coincidentally, but probably not. But I woke up in Utah. I looked out the window. I saw mountains. I knew where I was living in Boston, there was no mountains. So I was certainly very far away from home. And I was sent off to a wilderness treatment center. So I stayed there for 120 days, which seemed at the time like a really long time. I had a slip up. Well, I had a relapse. It wasn't necessarily a slip up. It was a conscious decision to use drugs again. So that's kind of a nicer way of putting it than necessary. But during my stay in wilderness, after that, on March 20, 2014, after that, I went to a 90-day, they call it extended care. I think that's the nomenclature that's commonly used, right? And in that extended care, we would go, there's group therapy multiple times a day, but really the focus on the extended care at that treatment facility was, let's build a community, you get a job, you work out, you develop hobbies, you form a new identity. And that was really what was missing for me. The thing that I identified in my first use, right, is this is my identity now, this is who I am. And when they strip that away, then I have nothing, right? I haven't developed any relationships on the basis of anything but drugs since I was 12 years old.
So how long did you stay in sort of a structured recovery program, Peter?
I think it was between 18 months and 2 years. So quite a long time. Well, you know what? Yeah. It's funny. It seems like that, but I kind of joke I have some friends that I went to to the treatment center, the initial one, with staying with me this week, actually. And we always joke about like how nice it would be to go back now,
right.
Work and
what about it? Yeah. What about it was appealing? Tell us,
yeah.
Because people think about treatment as this onerous thing. Talk about it as the other side.
And my experience before this was that, right? That everybody's there because they have to be, and we're just sort of in this uninteresting place with nothing inspiring to do. And like I said, our identities are stripped away from us. What made this particular experience, I think, successful was, of course, there's the emphasis on the clinical side and on attending 12-step meetings and things like that. But the main sort of emphasis outside of that was on taking ownership of your future. And by that, I mean, it's a mountain town in Colorado. It's no secret that there's a lot of using and alcohol abuse. And I mean, in every town in America, but particularly in the one where this treatment center is located. And they don't try to hide you away from any of that. Ultimately, they want the decision to not drink and not use to be your own. And on that basis, you can form your new identity. For me, that was, we went mountain biking and rock climbing, skiing, whatever, the season, whatever activity the season called for on a regular basis. And I formed new relationships based on the identity of a sober person that enjoys the outdoors. And that became my identity. And that's stuck. I'm, of course, so many more things now as I've become a part of life.
So round out that picture for us. You just said, I'm so many more things. Who are you? Yeah.
Well, I just finished like 5 years of school. So I have 2 degrees. I'm a boyfriend. I'm a dog dad. I'm a friend. I'm definitely a friend to my parents, which is after graduating college and being out on my own, I've transitioned. I'm still a son, but I can be a friend now too. It blows my mind every day that mostly, the first thing that I sort of feel on a routine basis is that I have no desire to there's alcohol in my house. I go to parties with people that drink. I go to parties with people that don't drink. I don't do anything that I wouldn't do if I wasn't an alcoholic, except for drink. I don't feel any desire. It doesn't interest me. It doesn't repulse me. It's been removed from me entirely. So,
wow, we don't hear that very often. We don't hear that at the nugget of desire.
Yeah, it's just gone. It's completely gone. So
you don't live each day fighting back an urge.
No. I mean, and that being said, right, there is a daily reprieve based on the things that I do in my personal life and 12-step programs that I'm involved in. And there's some personal growth required on a daily basis to continue feeling that way, but it is not a daily battle.
Like? Yeah.
That
what
looks
does
like,
it look like?
Yeah. So for me, that's a routine of prayer and meditation twice a day. These are all very straightforward things. And it's funny. I think in early recovery, I try to make things very complicated and personal to me and pursue these like obscure Western practices or something. But really what works is basic prayer and meditation, talking to my friends in recovery. I sponsor people. That's an important part of my experience as a sober person. And that's really the extent of it. I go to meetings several times a week. That varies depending on my schedule. I have one meeting that I don't miss. There's obviously exceptions to that, but one meeting that I don't miss, that's referred to as the home group, and a couple others that are good ways for me to meet newcomers. But, I think a lot of people might say, I want to hide my sobriety and not sort of make it part of my identity, but I think it is, right? And ultimately a lot of addiction is just an identity crisis and sort of battling back and forth with who we are. So I find for me that owning it and being, you don't have to be my coworkers, for example, I don't have conversations with them about my sobriety, but if somebody were to ask me, hey, Peter, I noticed you weren't drinking at the party. I'm having a hard time drinking or stopping drinking. That's why I find it necessary to be public. So at least to some extent with my sobriety is. I can't tell you how many times in the last 8 years that I've had people come up to me and say, hey, I'm having a hard time. I drink too much. Can you give me some advice? Or can you talk to me? And that's amazing, right? That's priceless.
Wow, what a gift that is to be able to take your positive experience and the growth you've endured and the coals you've walked across and be able to offer somebody else something based on that.
That's pretty awesome. I mean, that was promised to me at the beginning of my sobriety, that I will see how my experience can benefit others. And I've certainly hung on to that through the hard times. Because it's always been true, regardless of what I've gone through. Yeah.
Someday this will be good for me and somebody else. That's the mantra, right? Someday in those moments. Yeah, I like that. So what advice do you have for those parents living in those upwardly mobile, competitive, high-achieving neighborhoods across our country and maybe in the world, I don't know, who are assuming, quote unquote, that the kids are okay? What advice?
Well, yeah. Well, I think it's, at least for my parents and sort of, it's easy to justify, oh, well, we're different. Addiction looks different for us because we're well-to-do and well-educated or in a privileged neighborhood. Addiction doesn't sort of manifest itself in the same way, but it absolutely does. The only thing sort of separating me from someone that ends up, sleeping on the street because of their addiction is that my parents have a lot of money, and that's pretty much it. My desperation, my desire to use, the compulsion, all of those things, are more or less the same, in every person that feels this way. But I think it's really easy to sort of try to take control of the situation yourself and jam lots of different treatment options down their throat, right? And force them into all these different situations. I'll tell you, like, it's certainly natural to want to protect your child and keep them from ultimately, dying from the disease of addiction. So I can't say in good faith, leave them out and cut them off completely, because that is not what worked for me. But I would say that the thing that ultimately forced this to stick, and I sort of identified this earlier, is at least some sense of ownership of their new life. I would say I didn't pay for everything. Obviously, I didn't pay for treatment or much of my cost of living when I got out, but the relative increase in responsibility I had for my own existence upon getting sober, I think contributed greatly to the sticking power. So for me, that looked like getting a full-time job immediately, working, the first job I had was a janitor. I don't think it needs to necessarily be that extreme, but that just happened to be the available position. And I had ownership. I had a paycheck coming in, and for me, when I was 18, that was the first job that I had ever worked. The first time I ever did laundry was after I got sober. There's a lot of things that most people might take for granted, but I didn't. I hadn't experienced. So ownership and responsibility in early sobriety are definitely very important, but you can't force sobriety on anybody. So being patient and loving with, from a distance is certainly effective too.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Peter Hogan. It is wonderful to see you here today. You have touched my heart and once again renewed my faith in youth. So thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, some of us are okay, at least, yeah.
Yeah, some of you are, absolutely. So you have all been enjoying Peter Hogan today, I hope, on Beyond the Balance Sheet podcast. If you have liked this episode and would like to continue, please like us on our platform, on your platform of choice. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Balance Sheet, a podcast designed to help advisors, clinical professionals, and affluent families solve some of their biggest medical, psychiatric, and emotional challenges. Visit beyondthebalancesheet.com to read more about our guests and resources, and sign up for our newsletter.